a few different times, and it's always great to talk to him. He is an independent journalist. He's also an author of several books, including We Are City Builders, What is Innovationism, and Kamala Harris and the Future of America. That one is a bit dated, to be honest, but everything else, I think you'll get a lot out of. And even that one is a great book. It's a glimpse
she's
into
making
what
a comeback.
Yes, it's a glimpse into.
She's dropping F-bombs now.
That's right. That's right. His new book is, of course, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. Please welcome back to the show our friend Caleb Maupin. Caleb, great to see you again, man.
Sure, glad to be here.
Absolutely. Yes. Great to see you again. Glad we could put this together. It's been a long time coming. I know this book has been out for a few months, but this is obviously a big conversation starter. The question of Trotsky and the neocons, a very hotly debated subject. It brings them out, man. Like we've seen even in the chat before we started the countdown, we got people arguing about this. You know, this really brings it out of people. All I could say is it is advised that you not take Tylenol before watching this interview. That's what I would say if you're going to watch it in the chat, right? Because I know
fucking trots.
Exactly. So that is the book, and it weighs into a long-standing debate, obviously, about the connection between Trotskyists and the rise of neoconservatism. So can you just lay out for us what are the origins of that debate, and on what side of it do you ultimately land?
Well, it's interesting. So during the Bush years, that's when we first started hearing about the neocons, right? The New York Times and others kind of picked it up, and they started talking about how there was like a faction of people around the Bush administration who were advocates of regime change. And they were neoconservatives, and they were, a lot of them were formerly Trotskyists. And, generally you got like the Alex Jones crowd would talk about it. And their narrative is like, they're libertarians. Oh, Trotskyists are communists. Communists hate freedom. The neocons also hate freedom. It's that simple. More recently, like in the last couple years, you've got this kind of Nick Fuentes narrative of like, communism is a Jewish conspiracy and the Trotskyists are all Jews and Zionism, and that's kind of, stupid. And there's actually some interesting history. If you go over why it is that so many people that were crafters of the very hawkish foreign policy that kind of defined the Republican Party, especially in the Reagan years up into the Bush administration, how they have their roots in Trotskyism. There's a very interesting story there. So I decided to write the book, and it's basically I go over Trotsky, who he was. I go over his fight with the faction called the New York Intellectuals in 1939. And then from there, I talk about how the New York Intellectuals went from left to right, and a lot of them ended up in the Republican Party during the Nixon years. And it says a lot. There's a lot there about geopolitics, about, what it means to be a leftist and ideology. It's an interesting story. And I mean, like one thing that comes up, for example, the name Max Shachtman. Right? That name is very obscure. If you're not a communist, you don't know that name. But if you want to play like 50 Degrees of Separation, or, what's the thing that the actor Kevin Bacon, like it all gets back to Kevin Bacon, like the entire Cold War political establishment gets back to Max Shachtman. He was the personal advisor, the top secretary of George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO. Jean Kirkpatrick, the UN ambassador under Ronald Reagan, had been, one of his YPSL, Young People's Socialist League activists when she was a young college student in New York City. Carl Gershman, who was running the National Endowment for Democracy, had worked with him. Irving Kristol had been a follower of Max Shachtman. It's like this guy, Max Shachtman, this kind of obscure New York City Trotskyist who ended up supporting the Vietnam War and the Bay of Pigs invasion. Like the left and the right all kind of get traced back to him. And it's kind of amazing to see how this guy is connected to like pretty much everybody in post-Cold War, post-Second World War USA Cold War politics, especially as the Cold War is approaching its end. And there's an interesting story there. It's a very interesting story about a group of intellectuals who did not like Trotsky and broke with Trotsky. They were his followers in New York City. There was a pretty ugly fight in the Socialist Workers' Party in the lead up to the Second World War. They broke with Trotsky. They formed their own movement and eventually laid the foundations for first the New Left and then later the Neoconservative Movement that dominated Republican politics.
I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Let me just, if I could just, sorry about that. That was my fault.
Yeah.
If I could just plant a flag there, because I already see some people in the chat asking, what is Trotskyism? Okay, so this is obviously a huge conversation, but as it pertains to the question of the Trotskyist neocon link, what in your mind, because I've heard you describe Trotsky as a sort of deviant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he was a Marxist. He didn't totally disavow the Soviet Union entirely, or totally disavow Marxism. Yeah, right, exactly. But he was, as you describe him, and you sort of place this in important context as it pertains to this debate. He was more pro-Western, as opposed to the more original Marxist Leninist. So can you kind of flesh out that distinction just so people have an idea where we're going?
Sure. Trotsky was a guy born in Kherson, in what is now contested in the war. He studied in Odessa, and he was a Russian radical. There was a big Russian intelligentsia, like radical circles in Russia, people that wanted to overthrow the Tsar, various political movements. He was a well-known Russian radical. He spent most of his life in exile in places like Vienna and Paris and London and New York City, and he loved New York City. He called New York City the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. And he was this well-known Russian radical who had been kind of around the Bolsheviks, but when they moved to form their own party, he wasn't willing to do it. And he had his own kind of faction. And when the Russian Revolution happened, he left New York City, went back to Russia, joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, just right before they took power. And he was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union temporarily. And he was just a prominent, well-known Bolshevik leader at that point. And then he had a falling out with the Soviet leadership. There was kind of a fight between him and Stalin. Stalin became the leader. He didn't get along with Stalin. He was, exiled out of the country, moved to Turkey. He moved to France and eventually moved to Mexico. And in exile, he tried to form his own communist movement that would be opposed to the Soviet Union. And it was like his own breakaway from the Soviet Union, from the official brand of communism, the Communist International. And it was largely centered around a theory that he developed called the concept of the permanent revolution. That's really what defined Trotskyism, this idea that if you're in what he would call a backward country, like a country that's underdeveloped, like Russia at that time, or Vietnam, or China, or South America, or something like that, you can't really fully have socialism. You can have the working class take power, but then they have to spread revolution to where it really counts, which is the West. Right. And the West is the best. The West is the center. It's about taking down the Western centers, having the industrial workers of the Western countries seize control of the West. That's the focus. And that he really wanted the Soviet Union to just kind of be a military holdout to spread revolution into the Western countries. Whereas Stalin was saying what we need is socialism in one country. We'll sign treaties with the West. We'll bring in foreign investment to stabilize and build up our economy. We're not on a mission to spread communism all over the world. We're instead, focused on building up and stabilizing and improving living conditions in the Soviet Union. That's when Stalin did his 5-year plans that raised the life expectancy and conditions of the people in the Soviet Union very rapidly, industrialized the country, etc. Stalin was saying that we basically have to focus on building up socialism in one country. Trotsky, on the other hand, was saying, well, we need to militarize the economy and we need to focus on kind of just, preparing to march communism into the West. And that was Trotsky's thesis, the concept of the permanent revolution, put him at odds with the Soviet leaders. He was in exile and he kind of built his own movement. And a lot of the intellectuals who had been attracted to the Bolshevik Revolution when it started, but didn't really like how the Soviet Union turned out. The Soviet Union was a bit conservative. It wasn't, it wasn't this like Shangri-La workers' paradise. It was a pretty authoritarian society. And because they didn't really like it, Trotsky kind of held on. Trotsky was their way of holding on to kind of the vision of this kind of pure egalitarian socialism. And he built a movement called the Fourth International. And he was this writer and intellectual. And in the final years of his life, he kind of functioned as a professional anti-communist. He'd been there. He'd been part of the Russian Revolution. And so he had the credibility to go around the world and say, well, the Soviet leaders, Stalin, they sold it all out. It's awful. And he had that credibility. And William Randolph Hearst, who had the Journal American, which was kind of the tabloid, the New York Post of the 1930s, would feature articles by Trotsky, why the Soviet Union will fail, why the Soviet Union's going to fall. At one point, they even wanted him to testify against Roosevelt before the U.S. Congress. Shortly before his death, he received an invitation from the Dies Committee. Martin Dies was a Republican who didn't like Roosevelt, was accusing Roosevelt of being a communist sympathizer because Roosevelt was kind of aligned with the Communist Party. So they reached out to Trotsky, and they were going to bring Trotsky to the United States to testify before the Martin Dies Committee, which later became the House Un-American Activities Committee, about Roosevelt being, cozying up to Stalin or whatever. And Trotsky was willing to do it. But of course, these are Republicans, and Trotsky is a Marxist. And so they ultimately rescinded the invitation. But Trotsky, in the final years of his life, he was being boosted by fascists. Basically, whatever the Soviet Union was doing, he did the opposite. For example, Ukraine was a big issue at that time, right? And the Nazis were funding people like Stepan Bandera and people that wanted to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union, Ukrainian nationalism. Well, Trotsky and his followers went around advocating an independent Soviet Ukraine, kind of echoing Nazi foreign policy. Spain was a very big issue, right? You had Franco, the fascist, kind of waging a civil war against the Spanish Republic. Communists from all over the world are going to Spain to fight for the Republic. So Trotsky and his followers in the POUM, which was like the Trotskyite group in Spain, they launched an armed uprising against the Spanish Republic, saying it wasn't really communist. You had the Battle of Catalonia, where George Orwell was there, and they were, instead of fighting the fascists, they were fighting the Spanish Republic because it wasn't a true workers' revolution or whatnot. And there's many examples of this. And like one of the most telling things is, he's killed just as World War II is breaking out. And he's killed, and when France is invaded by the Nazis, the communists of France are saying defend the homeland and are kind of trying to build anti-Nazi resistance. And Trotsky condemns them for it and says, well, no, it's neither Germany nor France, workers of the world unite. And he's condemning the communists of France for building up popular nationalist resistance to the Nazi invaders. And I think ultimately, if you look at what Stalin said, the reason he was killed was they feared he would play a disruptive role in the Second World War. His followers in America were joining the U.S. military and trying to form labor unions to disrupt the war effort. And that he was basically trying to demobilize the war effort. He kind of took a plague on both your houses position in the Second World War. And that would have weakened the Soviet Union in their fight against the Nazis. So ultimately he was killed. He was convicted in absentia of, conspiring to kill Stalin, right? And there's a lot of debate about was that actually true or not. But he was, we had the Moscow trials where, some prominent Soviet leaders confessed to having conspired with Trotsky to overthrow Stalin and bring Trotsky to power with Nazi support. And, some people maintain that was just Stalin, trying to secure his power. Other people maintain there is a lot of credibility to it. There's no question, though, that the Axis powers were boosting Trotsky, that his book, The Revolution Betrayed, was distributed by Mussolini pretty widely. And I often make the point that, Trotsky is actually kind of like the mirror of a guy named Otto Strasser. So, in Germany, you had the Nazis took power. And one of the founding Nazis was this guy named Gregor Strasser. And he was just one of the founding Nazis. And then on the night of the Long Knives, Hitler killed Gregor Strasser. It was like a rival Nazi. So Gregor Strasser's brother went into exile, fled to Britain. And he had a radio broadcast into Nazi Germany saying, I'm the true Nazi, and Hitler has sold out and abandoned Nazi principles. And it was a big part of British propaganda against the Nazis during World War II, is they had this guy, Otto Strasser. He was basically the Nazi Trotsky.
The good Nazi.
Yeah, and that was, kind of part of the propaganda. During the Second World War, they were broadcasting propaganda from Nazi Germany into the Soviet Union. Some of it was Russian nationalism, and some of it was Trotskyist propaganda they were broadcasting into the Soviet Union, saying, well, nothing wrong with communism, but, Stalin's abandoned communism, embraced Trotsky and the permanent revolution. So, yeah, it was just kind of a knockoff brand of communism that was useful to the Axis powers during the Second World War, and later became a mechanism for trying to separate leftists from the Soviet Union in the post-World War II years.
Okay, you've talked about the cultural Cold War and the way that you mentioned someone from the CIA actually going in and saying, you know what, we can subvert this from the left. That'll be the most effective way to do it. Now, coming out of a New York art scene, this is something that I've become educated about over the course of doing this show, partly from you. Reading your work, partly from our own audience, turned me on to this. When I was coming up there, when you still had that kind of Woody Allen New York intellectual scene, This actually makes a lot of things fall into place for me, because Trotsky was who they would reference when they would reference communism. Like they would lump Trotsky in almost with this very romanticized vision of the radical art scene of the 30s. They'd lump him in with Hemingway and T.S. Eliot. It was all part of this very romantic vision of that era, of which they very much saw themselves heirs. But it was a very defanged thing. I mean, Woody Allen captured that very well. He represented it, that it was a punchline, it was a joke, they liked affiliating themselves with that, but not in a meaningful way, in a cultural way. So what happened there? What was that process?
So there was this magazine called Partisan Review, and it was the very, very trendy, like artistic, intellectual magazine of the New York City scene that you're describing, right? In the late 1930s, there were these writers and intellectuals. Sidney Hook was a well-known professor. There was a guy named James Burnham, who I believe was the head of the philosophy department at NYU. And it had been a Communist Party publication. It had gone out of business, and then it had been like resurrected as an anti-Stalinist Marxist publication in the late 30s. It was called Partisan Review, and a lot of well-known college professors and intellectuals and essayists wrote for it. After the Second World War, the USA enters McCarthyism. And, being a communist had been quite a trendy thing to do. Roosevelt was friendly to the Communist Party. The Soviet Union were allies of the United States in the Second World War. So you had a lot of writers like Lillian Hellman, people like Albert Einstein that had been friendly with the Communist Party.
The whole like New York theater scene were avowed communist in the 30s.
Right. But post-World War II, suddenly being a communist is public enemy number one. You're working for the enemy, you're a traitor, you're all of this. So the Communist Party is being heavily persecuted by the FBI. It's being pushed out. However, amid all of this, when the Communist Party is like basically illegal, when the leaders are in jail, their publications are banned from the mail, all of this, 1949, they pulled off something very amazing, which was the Waldorf Peace Conference. They had a conference at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, where Paul Robeson was there, and W.E.B. Du Bois and Shostakovich, and they kind of took advantage of the fact that the United Nations was in New York City, so a lot of Soviet writers and stuff could come, and they had this really big conference where, amid McCarthyism, amid all of this, many famous writers and intellectuals got up and defended the Soviet Union and said that the Soviet Union was right in the Cold War and that the USA was wrong. I believe, Will Geer, who was the actor, who's like, he was there, and, Aaron Copland, the musical composer. And even amid all of this McCarthyism, you had a lot of intellectuals that would defend the Communist Party. The CIA is obviously furious about this. How can this be? And they hired these ex-Trotskyists, these former Trotskyists, these New York intellectuals associated with Partisan Review, to like disrupt the conference. And they did crazy stuff. Like they like interfered. They like got its mail delivered to their address to prevent the mail from going to the conference, and put out fake press releases. And it was like a whole intelligence operation against the Waldorf Peace Conference that they waged. And it was being done by Sidney Hook and by this guy, Irving Kristol. Now, Irving Kristol, eventually they form a program, a CIA program, which the CIA brags on its website is one of their most successful programs, called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And they start funneling money to Partisan Review magazine to put out a brand of like anti-Soviet leftism. And in Britain, they have a magazine called Encounter. In Germany, they have a magazine called Der Monat. They have the Paris Review in France. And these magazines just go everywhere in the late 1950s, especially as McCarthyism is going away. They're like the new trendy leftist magazines that are against McCarthyism, that are against, critical of U.S. foreign policy, against racism, but very anti-communist. And they wage these kind of like cancel culture hate campaigns against people like Albert Einstein and Lillian Hellman that are defending the Soviet Union. And, they find, for example, James Baldwin is an African-American intellectual who is anti-racist, but also very anti-communist. And they blow him up with the Paris Review to be kind of the alternative to, Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of the black activists that are sympathizers with the Soviet Union. And it's Irving Kristol, who's the director of the program. And, Irving Kristol is, he's the father of Bill Kristol, the guy who, the Weekly Standard. I mean, one of the big neocons. And you know, his obituary in the New York Times it's like hilarious. You read how elitist he was. They ask, you know, he describes how he stopped being a communist. And he says when he was a New York intellectual, he'd written about the working class, but he'd never actually met them. And he got drafted into the army and he met the actual working class, these Midwestern street toughs that he didn't like. He thought they were anti-Semitic. And, you know, he said, I can't build socialism with these people. They'll just make a racket out of it. And I'm an intellectual for a reason. And that there's this elitism that really flows from that, right? And this sense of superiority. And as the Congress for Cultural Freedom is, you know, pushing this new brand of leftism that's being funded by the CIA, they're kind of changing what it means to be a leftist entirely, right? Leftism is populism. It's, you know, the struggle of the masses of people against the ultra rich, the struggle of the workers to control the means of production. But they turn it into something different. It's kind of the struggle against intellectual conformity, right? It's the struggle of the intellectual for freedom. Fascism, suddenly it's no longer, you know, the Marxist understanding is that fascism is when capitalism enters an economic crisis. The state, you know, the state is used to kind of heavily control and militarize the economy to stabilize a capitalist crisis. That's the Marxist understanding. The CIA-funded publications are saying fascism is an aesthetic, fascism is populism. Hannah Arendt is one of these people who's being boosted by the CIA. She writes this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is, you know, Adolf Eichmann is a Nazi war criminal who's in Argentina. He's apprehended by Israel. He's executed, and she goes to his trial, and she writes this book, you know, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a study in the banality of evil, saying that Eichmann is just an ordinary guy. And before he was a Nazi, you know, he was a YMCA guy. He was part of the YMCA. And that deep down, ordinary people are authoritarian and hateful and bigoted. Theodor Adorno is one of the people that, you know, the German Der Monat publication and the Frankfurt School in Germany promotes. He does this book called The Authoritarian Personality, arguing that Nazism is rooted in this kind of, you know, tendency of people to join groups and fight for causes. And that, you know, it's an attack on not just Nazis, but also on communists, on Christians. It's like this idea that there are some people that just join mass movements and they're dangerous because they will suppress the great intellectuals, right? And that suddenly leftism is about this kind of non-conformity, this kind of fear of the masses of people. And that, you know, for example, like one of their big things is that at the time, leftism was associated with what's called social realism, like Hemingway, like John Steinbeck, and also, you know, like there was what they called socialist realism in the Soviet Union. And if you go to Moscow, like the subways are decorated with, you know, like statues of real people. Like there's a woman feeding chickens and there's a guy who works in a machine shop. And, you know, they have these beautiful statues in the Moscow subways of ordinary people making ordinary people into heroes, right? And that's, you know, the idea that ordinary people fighting for their community and going out and doing the work of the world are heroes. That's social realism. And that's what leftists promoted. And Roosevelt hired social realist painters to paint the, you know, the post offices throughout the United States and make murals and all of that. Social realism.
Well, and that's when you start getting plays like Death of a Salesman and Clifford Odets writing about working people for the first time. There had never been plays like that.
Yeah, and the CIA doesn't like social realism. It views it as potentially dangerous because it's about politics and it's glorifying working people, et cetera. So the CIA starts funding abstract art and the work of Jackson Pollock. You know, Jackson Pollock was this kind of leftist painter or whatever, but he splattered paint on a canvas. And Jackson Pollock, they start funding his work as the edgy new alternative to social realism. And social realism, they say, is totalitarian. It's brainwashing. It's mind control. But abstract art and, you know, just splattering paint on a canvas or just shapes or whatever, that's called freedom, right? And it's suddenly
you get pop art for this kind of pose of ironic detachment. Like I get the joke. I'm in on the joke, and that allows me to indulge in the system without being part of the system, right?
Right. And
Wittgenstein, Warhol.
The idea is that art is supposed to make you feel disorganized. Art is supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to confuse you. It's right. You know, it's like the essays, they actually are writing like they want you to feel differently, right? They don't like the feeling that you get from social realism when you read The Grapes of Wrath or you look at a Diego Rivera mural. They don't like that feeling in particular. And they want you to be confused. They want you to be demoralized. It's like they're playing like weird psychological games. It's very fascinating how what you can call the new left, which is basically a CIA creation, they're not just going against Soviet communism. They're really going against a certain mindset, and they're kind of cultivating intellectuals to be pessimistic and all of that. But, you know, the 1960s comes along and the civil rights movement turns into the Black liberation movement. And a lot of the Black liberation fighters are supporting the Vietnamese and supporting the Cubans and et cetera. The 1967 war happens, and a lot of the student radicals that are opposing the Vietnam War are opposing Israel. And so a lot of these CIA funded intellectuals that are like leftists, suddenly they see the new left as kind of beyond their control. It's suddenly an anti-imperialist movement. So they pivot into supporting Richard Nixon. And, you know, Irving Kristol was a Nixon supporter. And eventually this Max Shachtman, you know, he had been a supporter of Henry Jackson, who was like a moderate Democrat. But when the Democrats nominated, you know, McCarthy in 1972, who was like very far left, he didn't like that. And so he went in and supported Richard Nixon just before he died. And that a lot of these New York intellectuals, they were so anti-communist. Communism was the main threat. And they had helped create the new left as like a leftist intellectual barrier against communism. But then they saw the new left kind of be effective and build, you know, a serious anti-war movement, the Black liberation movement. And so based on that, they went into Nixon's camp. And it's these people that very much kind of defined, you know, the beginning of the kind of late Cold War right wing of Ronald Reagan. And Sovietology. Now, this was a big field in like the 70s and 80s of people who learned to speak Russian, and they studied the Soviet Union, and they equated the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. And they developed kind of the theory was that, you know, America is opposed to quote unquote totalitarianism. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and all these other countries are totalitarian. America's on a mission to destroy such countries. That was the feeling in the Sovietology schools of academia. And they would read Lenin in the original Russian, and they would read, you know, Nazi texts, and they're the same thing. They're mass totalitarian movements, drawing from that new left Hannah Arendt mindset. And America is on a mission. And this intellectual named Leo Strauss emerges. And Leo Strauss is a very, very interesting figure. Never a Trotskyist, but he was a guy who had fled Nazi Germany. He was a professor at New School in New York, and then he eventually went to the University of Chicago. And he becomes kind of the mentor to a lot of these people. And his big book is called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And he interprets Plato. And he argues that all the great philosophers of history have had to write in code, because if the people really knew what they think, they would persecute them, right? And that some people are just naturally superior to others. They're philosopher kings in the Platonic sense. And that the job, a good society protects those people. And it's okay for the philosopher kings to lie to the masses of people. He writes a lot about the noble lie, the idea that, you know, that average people are just too stupid to understand politics. And if you actually tell them the truth, society will come apart, right? So it's okay to lie to them. You know, he writes about this, and like they say his favorite television show was Gunsmoke, right? The old cowboy Western where the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good. The bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad. And he says that's how average Americans should come to understand politics. It should be an episode of Gunsmoke where America is all good and the people that oppose America are all bad, love it or leave it, the greatest country in the world, all of that. And that's Leo Strauss. And he's kind of mapping out foreign policy propaganda strategies for the Republican Party, sitting down with these people. And I mean, it's telling because we have, you know, at the time that neoconservatism becomes kind of dominant, we have two presidents in America who actually literally take on a cowboy persona. Ronald Reagan is literally a cowboy actor from Hollywood, right? Bush, you know, he's born in Connecticut, but he puts on the cowboy hat and he's got Barney out there and he's cutting brush on it. He's going to smoke him out. He's going to smoke him out and all of this. And this is, you know, for a generation, for boomers who grew up watching cowboy TV shows and cowboy movies, it's like, this is the neoconservative strategy. It's very interesting to see it all, but there's an elitism, right? And this kind of contempt for the people, the idea that people are dangerous and need to be controlled. That's kind of the continuity you can see there.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, I mean, I think the cowboy point is really fascinating and great. But, you know, you can also see just foundationally how, you know, permanent revolution, when weaponized, you know, the way the neocons have, really is the sort of driving ideology, you could say, behind a lot of these regime change wars, right? I mean, and so like the most notable, or I should say one of the most interesting case studies in the sort of Trotskyist to neocon pipeline is Christopher Hitchens, who spoke very fondly about his Trotskyist roots, even well into the, you know, Iraq war days, right before he died when he was really, championing that full-blown neocon foreign policy. And Ben Burgess wrote a book about him years and years ago. We had him on years ago back on our audio show to talk about it. And he posed the theory that perhaps when a lot of these Trotskyists get older and get jaded and cynical about the futility of bottom-up workers' revolutions, in Hitchens's case, he posited the theory, obviously this is speculation, that perhaps they view the United States and the United States military as being an institution and a mechanism capable of instigating, egging on, aiding and abetting these revolutions around the world to combat totalitarianism. And of course, what do they take the form of? Regime change wars. So I thought that was an interesting theory. I don't have 1% the knowledge or background on this topic that you did. So I wanted to float that to you and ask what you think about that, just ideologically.
Well, Hitchens is quite a bit later. I mean, his trajectory,
sure.
And
right.
What's interesting for Hitchens, he was like a leftist, but then he didn't like the Islamic Revolution of Iran. That was, from what I understand in his biography, he was horrified by the left supporting the Islamic Revolution of Iran because the Islamic Revolution of Iran was so conservative, right? I mean, it was the Ayatollah, government, and they were rejecting the West in a cultural sense. They rejected the West, and they were kind of embracing traditional Shia Islamic values. It's kind of interesting. There's a Hollywood movie that came out in like 1980, 1981, starring Warren Beatty, and it's called Reds. And at the end of the movie Reds, they have, John Reed's character played by Warren Beatty goes to the southern USSR to an Islamic area. And he gives a speech, and it's supposed to the subtle implication is like, oh, you've rock bottomed. You're supporting the Ayatollahs now. And it was a subtle dig at the left for supporting the Islamic Revolution of Iran at the time, and that's clearly what it was. And that in the movie Reds, it's kind of sympathetic to American communists, the people Louise Brandt and John Reed who helped start the American Communist Party, but it's also saying don't actually support the Soviet Union. Don't actually support these governments around the world. You watch the movie Reds, it's kind of a nuanced anti-communism from the Carter administration. It's very interesting. But yeah, with Christopher Hitchens, he didn't support the Islamic Revolution of Iran, and he was just kind of repulsed by the anti-imperialism. And that kind of gets to the essence of it, right? When Lenin started the Bolsheviks, the Bolsheviks were a weird spin-off of Marxism, and people don't get this, but like Marx had said, there are no nations. Workers of the world unite, right? And Lenin says, well, actually, if nations are struggling against imperialism, nationalism can be good. That's a big change, right? Lenin comes out with this whole theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and says capitalism has moved to the rule of big monopolies and finance capital dominating the whole world. We're not struggling. It's not the factory worker versus the factory owner anymore. It's the people of the world against the imperialists and the big monopolies. And Lenin says that because of imperialism and because they've been able to buy off some workers in the Western countries, the revolutionary energy is going to be in the East. It's going to be in the colonized world. Marx had thought the revolution would be in Germany first, right? But Lenin is saying, well, actually, it's going to be in the impoverished countries. And it'll be their struggle for national liberation against imperialism. It'll be kind of them struggling to free their nation from imperialism. That'll be the basis of bringing socialism or communism into the world. That's a huge break. And Lenin even comes up with a new way to organize a party called democratic centralism. And, you read these social democrats and these Marxists and the British Labour Party and the German Social Democratic Party. They look at the Bolsheviks and they say, this reminds us of a monastic religious order or a cult or something. This isn't a real party, right? This is a strange sect or something like that. Bolshevism was a weird spin-off of Marxism that was very, very Russia specific and had a very new interpretation. And Trotsky never really adopted that worldview. Trotsky was very much a European social democrat. He liked the Labour Party in Britain. He liked the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And when the Bolsheviks moved to form their own party, he said, no, I'm going to form the August Bloc. Which will be it'll be the radical version of European social democracy. And after Trotsky broke with the Soviet Union and with Stalin, that's what his followers did. They joined the Socialist Party and tried to form a radical faction. And that Trotsky wants to be part of Western leftism, right? That's a really big part of his personality. Even though he's from Russia, he wants to be part of Western leftism, and he doesn't really embrace the Bolshevik turn, which is that imperialism is the target. It's the colonized people of the world fighting against the imperialists. He doesn't embrace that. Trotsky is a Western Marxist. He's, social democracy before the Russian Revolution, before the First World War. Social democracy was a huge movement. And I mean, even today, forces that, like the DSA-ish kind of politics, that was pretty mainstream in Europe. The German Social Democratic Party was probably one of the biggest political parties in the world at that time. And the British Labour Party comes out of this, and that Marxist parties, Marxist labor unions, Marxist marching bands and choirs, that was pretty mainstream in Europe. And then when World War I came along, all these parties that were supposed to be fighting for the working class and revolutionary signed up and supported World War I. And it was a huge betrayal. And people like Rosa Luxemburg and people like Eugene Debs and others, they were just horrified to see that this movement they had supported, which was supposed to be a revolutionary movement, was sending workers off to die in their millions, right? And that's the basis of this kind of new reinterpretation. And communism or Bolshevism, the Leninist theory, is saying that basically European social democracy is corrupt. And Lenin called it a stinking corpse. And we're building a completely new movement of people around the world, colonized people fighting against that system. That's a whole new thing. And Trotsky he still had one foot in European social democracy. He wanted to be the radical version of European social democracy, whereas the Soviet Union and Lenin had completely broken. And that's, when you look at Christopher Hitchens and how he just couldn't support the Islamic Revolution of Iran, and he just couldn't support people against the West because they're not Western, right? It's like a matter of principle. That you always support the people of the world struggling against the Western imperialists. At the time that the Soviet Union came into existence, there was a guy in Afghanistan called the Emir of Afghanistan, and he was a conservative monarchist, and he was fighting the British Empire. And the Bolsheviks gave him weapons and gave him military support, and they said, we don't care what you are. You're fighting the British Empire. You're fighting imperialism. We support you. And they had the Congress of the Peoples of the East, where, the Soviet Union offered military support to anybody who was fighting the Western system. They saw the Western imperialist system as the main target. And, there were a lot of socialists like the British Labour Party and, like the German Social Democrats or whatever that were supporting imperialism. And their attitude was, we don't care if you call yourself a socialist. If you're supporting imperialism, you're on the wrong side. And it doesn't really matter what you call yourself. And that kind of understanding, that was the Bolshevik line, that was the Soviet political line, and that understanding is something Trotsky never fully embraced.
All right, now you mentioned that the DSA was another splinter group that kind of came off this association with Shachtman. Now this is a question that's come up a lot over the course of the show. Very often people will call what they brand as woke cultural Marxism. And when you talk to a lot of communists who reject a lot of the gender kabuki and that kind of thing, they'll say they're actually trots. These people are actually trots. When I've asked communists, why are they just constantly pushing all of the gender and coming up with the most divisive interpretations of race relations? Like, how can you argue that you're economically and class-based and continually stir up things that are going to create conflict between workers? And that's usually their answer. We did a segment about how the DSA very recently, which backed Mamdani, they had a whole conference talking about how they're going to bus people into New York and give them free youth gender medicine. Like, why? So can you explain that difference between, what is that? What is the difference between people who are communists, who very often reject that, and why do you have people who theoretically, like the DSA, have an economic analysis, who really, it's not just that they engage in that, they lead with it. They talk about that ahead of union drives, general strikes. That is front and center for these groups.
Yeah, the origins of DSA it's during the Vietnam War. The Socialist Party of America is still in existence, the old Eugene Debs Socialist Party, and they don't know what to do about the Vietnam War. And you have one faction that is led by pacifists like David McReynolds and others, the War Resisters League, and they say, we're pacifists, we're against the Vietnam War. They're now called the Socialist Party USA. They run in elections. And then you have another faction of followers of Max Shachtman that support the Vietnam War because communism and Stalinism is the greatest enemy. And they're called Social Democrats USA, and they break away. They support Ronald Reagan or whatever. DSA is like the majority of the Socialist Party. And their position was, well, we're against the Vietnam War, kind of. Like they want to negotiate. It's gone too far. We're not going to win. We want to negotiate. And Max Shachtman's like student, a guy named Michael Harrington, who served in Lyndon Johnson's administration. He wrote a book called The Other America, which was like a bestseller about poverty. Michael Harrington forms what's called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And if you look at the people that are on the board of the founding of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, it's just like CIA agents like you wouldn't believe. Gloria Steinem, the founder of Ms. Magazine, the voice of feminism, she brags openly about how the CIA made her what she is. She, they made her famous. They made her who she is. I mean, completely. She's no apologies, completely. Irving Howe is one of these Trotskyists who is part of the Partisan Review magazine crowd who's getting subsidized by the CIA, who actually had a big fight with Max Shachtman because Max Shachtman hadn't gone as far as supporting the USA in the Cold War, and he kind of beat Max Shachtman to it. And he said, we take the side of the West, and Max Shachtman is like scared to actually admit they're doing that. Irving Howe becomes like kind of the New York Times favorite go-to Marxist when it's time to denounce the student protesters. They call up Irving Howe and have him write a column where he quotes Marx and Lenin to denounce the student protesters. And Irving Howe, Michael Harrington, Gloria Steinem. It's just a collection of people that are, they call them the State Department Socialists. That's kind of the nickname they gave them.
Right.
And that's who started DSA. And that in the late 70s, as the 70s gets going, there were a lot of communist groups in America that got going coming out of the 60s that like went into the factories to sell their newspaper and things like that. And a lot of them were inspired by China, right? They were, they thought the Soviet Union is this old stodgy country, but China is the new revolutionary country. But then 1976, Mao dies. China's having market reforms. China's aligned with the United States and a lot of the wars that are happening. So a lot of these people, and they've worked in factories for a decade trying to recruit their coworkers to communism, and it's not working. So a lot of these Maoist communist groups start collapsing, right? And like the Revolutionary Communist Party, they had like a rally, death to Deng Xiaoping at the White House, where they like protested Deng Xiaoping. And like there's a group called the Communist Workers Party that like challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a fight, and the KKK showed up and shot 5 of them. And it's like this demoralizing time where all these communist groups are falling apart. DSA, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which eventually becomes DSA, is like almost like a deprogramming operation. It's like you can join us, and they tell you basically communism is un-American. These regimes around the world that are opposing U.S. imperialism, they're just as bad as, if not worse, than the United States. And you can join the Democratic Party. And that's kind of what DSA becomes. It comes a way that all these kind of 60s radicals who joined what they called the New Communist Movement can kind of become de-radicalized, and kind of, it's almost like a group therapy kind of atmosphere. And it's being funded by the United Auto Workers. I guess the head of the United Auto Workers was funding something called like the Progressive Coalition that had a lot of like money, and they're kind of taking 60s radicals and turning them into Democrats. And Harold Washington runs for, mayor of Chicago. Jesse Jackson runs for president in 1984. And that DSA is kind of a way of taking these like radical 1960s and 1970s communists who are very demoralized and confused and, pushing them into the Democratic Party. And that's the role that they play. And I've also often joked DSA is almost like the winter coat. You take your winter coat out when it's cold, but then you just put it back in your closet when it's not cold. That's how DSA is. I remember when I was first getting politically active during the Iraq War protests, DSA's name would be on the endorsers list of the protests. And people would say to me, are they still around? Is that still a thing? And it's like DSA, they kind of vanish, but then every so often, the U.S. government, the U.S. political system needs a socialist to come out of the woodwork. And so they find them, and they're college professors or whatever, and they appear, and then they go away, right? And that like people used to joke that like in the late 90s, DSA was a banquet that happened once a year where Cornel West gave a speech, and that was really it. I mean, it was, you had a lot of labor union bosses. Sweeney was the head of the AFL-CIO, was a DSA member, and that DSA was this kind of like socialist group that was there when the U.S. government needed there to be socialists as part of the discourse, but they'd rather not have them. But every so often they kind of reappear. And that's what DSA is. And that when you talk about, the divisive politics, that kind of fits. And again, that's kind of the continuity. Trotsky, his difference, one of his big differences with Lenin was over the peasant question. Trotsky hated the Russian peasantry. He thought they were backwards. He said peasants want to own their own lands. They want to become capitalists. So they're reactionary, right? They're a class without a future. Trotsky denounces Mao for building a peasant army because peasants are just backward and reactionary. Trotsky just hates the peasantry, and the peasantry are the majority of Russia at the time. And Lenin says, if we're going to take power, we have to form a coalition with the peasantry. And Trotsky says, no, the peasantry are a backward class. We can't do that. And that's rooted in Trotsky's experience. He was from Kherson, and peasants were very anti-Semitic. They had the pogroms where they'd go burn Jewish villages and do awful things. And that Trotsky viewed the Russian peasantry as reactionary, as his enemy, right? And there's this kind of anti-populism that Trotsky himself had that kind of flows through the New York intellectuals, through the neocons, all the way up to that. This idea that the people are the enemy. Anti-populism is a big part of it. And then, of course, anything that can be used to like show the majority as being bad is useful, right? So if you can find some oppressed group that can kind of deconstruct that, you can support them against the majority, right? That's a whole thing. There was at the time of the Bolsheviks were being formed, you had this group in Russia called the Jewish Bund. And they were a group of communists who said, because Jews are so oppressed in Russia, we have to have our own party. We have to have a separate party. And Lenin, who is himself of Jewish descent, says no. And he calls this the spirit of the ghetto. And he says the idea that Jews are just so special, they're just so different, they can't ever fit in, right? Zionism is the ultimate expression of that. But Bundism, which was this weird, form of communism for Jews only or whatever, he says it's another expression of this, right? And he says the road to the liberation of Jewish people from anti-Semitism is assimilation. And that the spirit of the ghetto is what he calls Bundism. That is kind of the mindset that is when you talk about anti-populism and all of that, you can kind of see a continuity there. That Trotsky aligned himself with the Jewish Bund against the Bolsheviks originally. He had this contempt for the peasantry. The 1939, the neocons, the people who become neocons, the New York intellectuals, they kind of share that mindset. And that, the Congress for Cultural Freedom is promoting that. And then you have Leo Strauss and that elitism and the noble lie. That's the continuity you can see. There's kind of an intellectual continuity that socialism and leftism in its essence is populism, right? It's the masses of people against the ultra rich. It's the struggle to seize the banks, factories, and industries. But there's kind of a fear of populism among certain intellectuals. And that's kind of the continuity between Trotskyism and neoconservatism that you can find.
I think that definitely makes sense, and it's interesting. It's an interesting debate because there are a lot of people who call themselves Trotskyists who I really like. Like, I don't necessarily think like it's a slippery slope and that you can't be a Trotskyist without eventually devolving into a neocon. I mean, hey, I'm a Jewish guy. I can't make the slippery slope argument now. Right? It's kind of a bad time to be saying, hey, if you're one thing, you must be the whole thing, right? But it is such an interesting debate, and it is this interesting phenomenon where, like, if you look to the UK, you got Jeremy Corbyn, who doesn't call himself a Trotskyist, but he's been associated with a lot of Trotskyists, and a lot of people sort of lump him in with that kind of in that DSA mold. And then you have Tony Blair, who was a Trotskyist, right? So it's a fascinating debate. It's a fascinating topic. You are a wealth of knowledge, as always. Really appreciate you coming on. The book is Trotsky and the Neoconservatives. Where can people find this before you go?
Yeah, anywhere books are sold. It's widely distributed. Let me just throw this in there. What you said there is important. I end the book. I have an appendix in there talking about one Trotskyist in Britain who was a pioneer for solidarity with Palestine. That was Jerry Healy. And the appendix of the book talks about, Vanessa Redgrave, the actress. She made a film supporting the Palestinians when that was not a trendy cause to talk about at all. And Jerry Healy was this British Trotskyist who was a friend of Gaddafi, was a huge anti-imperialist. And I end by talking about, even within Trotskyism, you have spin-offs that are genuine and anti-imperialist. And that increasingly I come to the conclusion that what you say is not as important as what you do, right? What are you actually doing? There's a lot of people who talk a good game, but when the crisis comes, what side are you on? And that, you know, like that's the whole thing. All these social democrats were all for the working class and against the wars, but World War I broke out and suddenly they supported the war, right? And that it's about what you do, and that, you know, there are Trotskyists who've done amazing, great things, right? And we should.
Well, yeah, I have to name drop my friend Shama Sawant, who's also a hero of mine, who is a Trotskyist. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's important to point out as well.
Yeah. But anyway, you can find my books. I got a website, calebmaupinbooks.net. My organization is called the Center for Political Innovation. We're always putting on conferences. We were disrupting the No Kings rallies recently to say hands off Venezuela. One of our supporters interrupted Keith Ellison in Minneapolis. And
really?
We're trying to just get anti-imperialism out there. We do book distributions about the Houthis in Yemen. And, you know, we're always just trying to be out there and advocate anti-imperialism and build a real movement for anti-imperialism. So thanks for having me on, you know, and I hope people enjoy the book. It's an important topic that's being discussed right now, and there's a lot of ignorance about it. And I decided to write the book because there is an important story there about where these neocons came from, et cetera.
All right. Well, I always learn so much talking to you, and there's so much going on that I'd like to talk to you about. We'll have to bring you on again soon, so we have a little more time to get more into things, because it's great having you, man. Oh, as always. Yeah. So check the book out.
Always fascinating and very educational.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Caleb. Appreciate it. Have a great one,
man.
All right. That's Caleb Maupin, everybody. Round of applause for Caleb. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, that's a topic that I've always heard kind of talked about. And so when he emailed us, he said, "Hey, I just had a book about this." I'm like, "Oh, cool. Now I actually, you know,
dude, I could." That's why before he went on, because I didn't even realize, or I guess I forgot he lives in New York. Yeah, I could talk to that guy for 10 hours.
Yeah,
like he is such a wealth of knowledge about these intellectual trends that, for me, I'm very curious about. That I really, when I came into this space, I was a sweet summer child about all that. Like, one of the main things I wrestled with is how did the culture get this way? And when you look at all that, I mean, his whole explanation of that, it really does explain why when you go to DSA, you got a bunch of people who can't talk to workers because it's rooted in a movement that doesn't like them. They have no real interest in that.
Right.